So we're continuing with the idea of domain and range. Okay. And what is the domain of a function? What is the range? Okay. Well, the domain of a function is a set of all allowable inputs. Okay, the set of all allowable inputs. Okay, or the set of inputs where my machine, my function, will give me something meaningful. Okay, so domain is related to inputs. Okay, domain is related to input. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Okay, what do I mean? Well, let's say, for example, I take a function. Let's say I take f of x here. Pretty simple. Let's take it x squared plus 3x minus 7. Okay. Is there a value of x which doesn't give me a meaningful answer? Okay, and the answer is no. Okay, for any x value I choose here, I'll be able to put it into this function. I can always square a number, that will never go wrong. I can always multiply a number by 3, and I can always subtract 7, so nothing will ever go wrong here. Okay? Every value of x gives a sensible value for f of x. Okay, which means the range, the domain is all real numbers. Domain is all numbers. Okay, it's totally fine. Any single number there is completely acceptable. Let's try a different example. Okay, a different one. Let's say I had I'll make it f of x here. Let's clean that up a little bit. F of x is equal to 1 over, let's say I have x plus 2 by x minus 3 on the bottom. Okay, and the question is, what's the range? Well, this is a little bit trickier. I am not allowed to divide by 0. Okay, remember, my spelling is terrible, that we cannot okay, we're just not allowed to do it. It doesn't make sense. Okay, there's no such a thing as division by 0 in standard number systems. And of course, we're only concerned with standard number systems here. Well, what numbers here could I put in which would give me a division by 0 if x was equal to minus 2, or if x is equal to plus 3, what happens? Well, here, if I put in the minus 2 here, then I would have minus 2 plus 2, and this multiplication term would give me a 0, which would mean I would have a 0 on the bottom, and I would be dividing by 0, and that doesn't make any sense. Also, if I have a 3 in here, then 3 minus 3 would be 0, and I would get what? I would get a 0 on the bottom, I would be dividing by 0, and that doesn't make sense. Then the denominator is 0. And the function has no output. It's basically like you put these numbers into the machine and it just says, nope, they don't work. Okay? Not acceptable inputs. Okay? This function here that we saw before, this f of x is equal to x squared plus 3x minus 7, this will take any input. It says, okay, well, you put in any input, I'll give you some output. Fine, no problem. This one's a bit more picky. It says, I can't take minus 2, and I can't take plus 3. Okay? Okay, so the domain here, so the domain is all numbers except minus 2 and plus 3. Okay. They are not within my set of allowable inputs. There's another really easy example, which is a very important one. It's the same basic idea. Suppose I had f of x was equal to just 1 over x. Okay, just divide the number 1 by the number x. What's the only number I'm not allowed to divide by? The only number I'm not allowed to divide by is 0. I can divide 1 by any negative number or any positive number, but not 0. Okay? Since we cannot divide by 0, okay, the domain is all numbers except zero. Okay, same basic idea, just a little bit simpler. Okay, so that's the set of allowable inputs. The way I always think about it is like a function is like a machine that you put a number into and then it spits out an output. Well, like this machine is very, very reliable. You put in any single number and you get a meaningful output back. The machine will always work. But these ones are a little bit more picky. If you put in the wrong type of input, the machine jams and you don't get anything meaningful out of it. Okay. Of course, there are other examples, okay, which is a little bit more complicated, okay. Let's say that f of x is going to be equal to the square root of x. Okay, what is the square root of x? Okay, well, in this case, the square root of x, okay, this depends on what I allow as an output, okay? Is the domain. In this case, it depends on the allowable output. Okay, if the square root of x has to be a real number, which means it exists on the number line. Okay, and over on the number line, then x here has to be non-negative, okay? Then negative values are not allowed. Okay. Okay. If, however, I'm allowed to have a complex number, then this is not a problem. Okay. It's allowed to be a complex number. Any x is allowed. Okay, so this one depends on context, but we can see that that's important. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is called the algebra of functions. This is very simple. It's really not as complicated as people think it is. I'll do it on a new page actually, just to, it's not quite a follow of this, okay? And this is important, okay? So that's domain. We'll talk about range. Actually, let's talk about range first, okay? Range of a function. Okay, what is the range? Is the set of outputs we can achieve. Okay, which is a pretty simple idea. Okay, for example, let's say I take f of x is equal to x squared. Okay, and say I look at the set of outputs that I can get from that. Okay, well, x is allowed to be any number. X can be positive, it can be negative, it can be 0. That's no problem. But anytime I square something, it will never be negative. Okay, I cannot get a negative output out of this. Okay. We cannot get a negative output. Okay, so the range is all numbers greater than or equal to 0, which means any non-negative number. Okay, we cannot get a negative output. Any non-negative number is fine. Okay, another example, which is maybe a little bit more complicated. Let's take f of x, a bit more complicated. It's the sine function. Okay, which means that x is a radian angle. Okay, and I take the sine of it. Sine is always a number between -1 and +1 inclusive. What does that mean? That means my range is -1 to +1 inclusive. Okay, so that's my range. Okay, that's the idea of range. Okay. For the most part, not always, but for the most part, the domain is the thing you need to be really careful with. Okay, the domain is the thing you need to be really careful with. Range, not quite so much. Okay, so fumes are actually starting to get to me. I'm going to take a break and I'll make another video in a little while. And then we'll do the algebra of functions. And we'll talk about notes of that. Now that's all again fairly straightforward, so I expect that we can get through this section in about, I don't know, maybe 5-6 videos. Okay. Okay, I'll pause there and I will get back to you guys in the next video.